Do you know who I am? I've written 7-figure checks to this hospital. One call and you're finished in this city, you and that baby both.
Do you know who I am? I've written 7-figure checks to this hospital. One call and you're finished in this city. You and that baby both. That's your choice to make. But that patient isn't moving. Marcus Vaughn had never been told no by someone he considered beneath him. He was about to learn what happened when the wrong person heard him say yes to violence. The ICU never stopped. It only shifted from crisis to crisis, breath to breath, the space between a flatline and a heartbeat measured in seconds and nerve. Tiana Brooks had worked this floor for 6 years. At 29, she was the nurse the attendings trusted when they weren't sure, the one the overnight residents called when protocols failed and instinct was all that was left. She didn't carry that authority loudly. She carried it the way good nurses always do, quietly, constantly, without ever being thanked for it. She was also 7 months pregnant. Her lower back had stopped asking for relief somewhere around hour 5. Now it simply burned. She adjusted her weight between rooms, pressed one hand briefly against her side, and kept moving. There was a post-op patient in room 4 whose pressure had been unstable since 2 in the morning. There was a family in the hallway who hadn't eaten since yesterday. There was always something. There was always someone who needed her more than her body needed rest. Her colleagues knew her the way coworkers know someone who is always present and never fully seen. She showed up. She was exceptional. She went home. Nobody knew where. She didn't talk about her childhood. She didn't mention family. When someone pushed, she smiled in the way that closed a conversation without being rude and moved on to the next task. Nobody knew. Nobody was supposed to. What the staff of Mercy General did not know, what Tiana had spent a decade making sure no one would ever know, was that she was Victor Draven's sister. Not by blood, but by something older and more binding than that. Victor did not appear in news cycles or shareholder reports. His name did not surface in city council meetings or charity galas. He existed in the negative space of the city's power structure, the silence behind closed doors, the reason certain decisions were never made twice. Law enforcement knew the shape of his organization, the way you know the shape of something large moving beneath dark water. They could see the displacement. They had never seen the thing itself. He had kept that world from Tiana completely, not out of shame, but because she had asked him to once when they were 17 and she had finally understood what he was becoming. Let me be normal, she had told him. Let me earn something that's actually mine. He had nodded. He had never questioned it. For 10 years he had honored that. But peace, as it turns out, is only as safe as the people who choose to leave it alone. If you're watching this and already hooked, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Comment below the time and where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story reaches. Now let's get into it. The ICU at St. Jude's behaved like a living, breathing machine, one that didn't care about the time of day or the exhaustion of its parts. The air was a sterile cocktail of isopropyl alcohol and the faint, metallic tang of blood. For Tiana Brooks, the rhythm of the monitors was the only music that mattered. At 31, and 7 months into a pregnancy that made every step feel like walking through deep sand, she was the steady hand that kept the unit from descending into chaos. She moved between room 4 and room 7 with a grace that defied her swollen ankles. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a reminder of the 12 hours she'd already spent on her feet, but she didn't complain. Instead, she paused by the nurse's station, resting a hand on the curve of her belly. She took a slow, measured breath, feeling the light kick of her daughter, and then she kept moving. To her colleagues, Tiana was a mystery wrapped in blue scrubs. She was the one who could find a vein in a collapsing patient when everyone else panicked, yet she never stayed for the aftershift drinks. She didn't talk about her childhood, her parents, or the brother whose name she had buried under years of quiet, honest work. "Tiana, can you check the prep on the post-op in 6? A younger nurse called out, her voice thin with stress. Tiana nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I've got it. Take 5 minutes, go breathe." As Tiana turned toward the room, she didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows of the far stairwell. Victor Draven did not belong in a place of healing. Tall, dressed in a black wool coat that seemed to absorb the fluorescent hallway lights. He stood perfectly still. His presence was a silent weight, a current beneath still water. He watched his sister through the glass partition, his eyes tracking the way she winced when she leaned over a bed to adjust an IV line. Victor had spent a lifetime ensuring the world forgot Tiana was a Draven. He had stayed away from her graduation, her wedding, and her daily life, honoring her plea to let her be just a person. He moved in a world of ledgers, shadows, and swift, cold consequences, a world he had kept entirely separate from the sterile peace of her ICU. But as he watched her rub her lower back, a flicker of something dark and protective crossed his face. He was the ghost she had asked for, the invisible guardian who ensured no one from his life ever touched hers. The city knew him as a myth, a man whose face appeared in no database and whose name was only whispered in the most guarded circles. For now, he was content to be a shadow in the corner of her vision. But peace, in a city built on power and greed, was a fragile thing. And as the clock on the wall ticked toward 2:14 p.m., the silence of the ICU was about to be shattered. The double doors of the ICU didn't just open. They were forced back with a violence that made the air in the hallway shudder. Marcus Vaughn stepped through first, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum, a sound that felt like a localized earthquake in the quiet unit. He was middle-aged, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson that clashed with the pristine white of his silk shirt. Behind him, a younger man in a disheveled suit hovered, clutching a hand wrapped in a blood-spotted handkerchief. "Where is the person in charge here?" Marcus's voice boomed, cutting through the rhythmic pulse of the heart monitors. He didn't wait for an answer, his gaze sweeping over the nurse's station with a look of pure, concentrated disdain. "I have an emergency, and I'm not waiting behind a curtain like a commoner." Tiana, who had been updating a chart for a patient recovery from a triple bypass, straightened her spine. She felt the heavy, familiar ache in her hips as she stepped forward, her hand instinctively resting on the side of her belly. "Sir, you can't be in here. This is a restricted unit for critical patients only." Marcus didn't even look at her face. He looked at her badge, then at her stomach, as if both were personal insults. "I don't care if this is the Oval Office. My assistant has a deep laceration. He needs a surgeon and he needs one 5 minutes ago. Move one of these people out. I don't care which one." "Sir, your assistant has a minor cut," Tiana said, her voice dropping into the low, calm register she used for grieving families and agitated patients. She didn't flinch. "He needs the urgent care wing, 3 floors down. Every bed in this unit is currently occupied by someone fighting to see tomorrow morning. I cannot and will not move them." Marcus stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive cologne and expensive rage radiating off him. He was a man who bought companies over lunch and crushed competitors for sport. He was unaccustomed to the word no, especially from a woman in blue scrubs. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Marcus Vaughn. My family's foundation practically built this wing. I could buy this entire hospital and turn it into a parking lot by Monday." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Tiana. "Clear a bed, now, or I will make sure you never work so much as a school nurse's office again." In the silence that followed, Tiana could hear the steady beep-beep of the monitors in the rooms behind her. She stood her ground, a quiet, pregnant nurse against a man worth billions, unaware that the shadow in the stairwell had shifted, and the cold, dark current of her brother's attention was now locked squarely on the man standing in front of her. The air in the hallway felt like it was ionizing, charged with a static tension that made the hair on the back of the junior nurse's neck stand up. Tiana didn't move. She stood with her feet planted, her hands still resting protectively over the life growing inside her, a living shield between the billionaire's entitlement and the fragile lives in the rooms behind her. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than his shouting. "The man in room 6 had a heart transplant 4 hours ago. If I move him, he dies. Money doesn't change the biology of a failing heart. Please go to urgent care." Marcus Vaughn's face went from crimson to a terrifying, pale violet. For a man who viewed the world as a series of assets to be managed or liquidated, being told, No, by a woman in a $30 set of scrubs was an existential threat. He saw the nurses in the background watching, their hands over their mouths, and he saw the reflection of his own loss of control in Tiana's calm, brown eyes. "You're a janitor with a medical degree," Marcus hissed, stepping so close that the heat of his breath hit her forehead. "You're nothing, and that thing you're carrying, it'll be lucky to grow up in a shelter by the time I'm done with you. Leave." "Now," Tiana commanded. The explosion was instantaneous. Marcus didn't think. He reacted with the unchecked reflex of a tyrant. His hand blurred through the air, a heavy, flat-palmed strike that connected with the side of Tiana's face with a sickening crack that echoed off the sterile walls. Tiana's head snapped to the side. The force sent her staggering back against the heavy medicine cart, her shoulder hitting the metal with a dull thud as she collapsed toward the floor. A collective gasp ripped through the unit, followed by a deafening, unnatural silence. Tiana gasped, clutching her belly as she sat on the linoleum, her vision swimming, a bright red welt blooming across her cheek. Marcus stood over her, adjusting his cufflink, a dark, jagged smile twisting his features. He didn't look at her with pity, he looked at her like a bug he had finally successfully crushed. "Consider that your notice," he spat, turning his back on her. "Check your email, you're fired, and I'm just getting started." He began to walk away, triumphant, already pulling out his phone to call the board of directors. He didn't see the shadow in the stairwell move. He didn't notice the man in black step out into the light, his face a mask of such absolute, lethal stillness that the air seemed to freeze in his wake. Marcus Vaughn walked away smiling, completely unaware that with one swing of his hand, he had just signed the death warrant for everything he owned. The ringing in Tiana's ears was louder than the frantic beeping of the heart monitors. She stayed on the floor for a heartbeat longer than necessary, her palm pressed against the cold linoleum, checking for the reassuring flutter of her baby. The physical pain in her cheek was sharp, but the hollow silence of the ICU was what truly cut. Her colleagues, the men and women she had bled and sweated beside for 6 years, stood like statues. No one moved to help her up. No one stepped into Marcus Vaughn's path. The heavy double doors swung open again, but this time it wasn't a stranger. Dr. Aris, the chief of medicine, hurried into the unit, his white coat billowing. He didn't look at Tiana, who was finally pushing herself to her feet using the medicine cart for leverage. He went straight to Marcus, his hands held out in a placating, desperate gesture. "Mr. Vaughn, please, I just heard. My deepest apologies for this disturbance," Dr. Aris stammered, his eyes darting toward the security cameras and then back to the billionaire's livid face. Marcus didn't even turn around. He pointed a trembling finger back at Tiana. "That woman assaulted me. She refused medical care to a donor and then became physically aggressive. I want her out of this building. Now. Or my foundation's $10 million pledge for the new pediatric wing vanishes before the ink is dry." Dr. Aris finally turned to Tiana. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only the cold, hard calculation of a man protecting his budget. "Tiana, hand over your badge." "He hit me, Aris," Tiana said, her voice cracking for the first time. She touched the swelling welt on her face. "There are witnesses. There is footage." "I saw what I needed to see," the doctor snapped, refusing to look at the other nurses. "Your hormonal instability has made you a liability to this hospital. You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Don't bother coming back for your things. We'll mail them to whatever address you can still afford." The betrayal felt heavier than the slap. Tiana looked at her fellow nurses, people she had mentored, people whose families she knew, and saw them look at the floor, their silence a collective shrug of shoulders. Marcus Vaughn watched her with a slow, predatory smirk, his victory complete. He had stripped her of her career, her dignity, and her safety in under 5 minutes. Tiana didn't argue. She reached for the lanyard around her neck and unclipped it. The plastic clicking as she set it on the nurse's station. She walked toward the exit, her head held high even as her knees shook. She passed the shadow in the stairwell, but she didn't look. She didn't have to. The air around the man in black had turned from cold to lethal, and as the doors closed behind her, the quietest man in the city began to move. By the time Tiana reached the parking lot, The world she had painstakingly built was already dissolving. She sat in her aging sedan, the side of her face throbbing in time with the frantic pulse of her heart. She reached for her phone to call a lawyer, but a notification banner was already waiting for her. Account restricted. Please contact your financial institution. A cold numbness spread from her chest to her fingertips. She refreshed the app, then tried her credit card at the nearby gas station just to be sure. Declined. Marcus Vaughn hadn't just fired her, he was erasing her. With a single phone call to his contacts in the banking sector, he had labeled her accounts as flagged for fraudulent activity. He knew she was 7 months pregnant, and he knew exactly how much she relied on those savings for the coming months. He was strangling her survival. She drove toward her modest apartment, her hands shaking on the wheel. She just needed to lie down to feel the baby move, to convince herself that she still existed. But as she pulled into the complex, she saw the white van. 2 men in work jumpsuits were already at her door, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a hammer echoing through the hallway. "What are you doing?" Tiana cried, her voice thin and ragged as she rushed toward them. One of the men looked at her with a flicker of pity that was quickly buried under professional indifference. "Emergency eviction, ma'am. Property owner's orders. Dangerous tenant clause. We're changing the locks and moving the contents to the curb. I have a lease." "I've never missed a payment," Tiana protested, clutching her stomach as if she could shield her daughter from the sight of her crib being hauled into the hallway. "The owner sold the building 20 minutes ago to a holding company," the man replied, stepping aside to let his partner pass with a box of her kitchen supplies. "They want the unit cleared by sundown." Tiana stood in the hallway, surrounded by the physical remnants of her life, her books, her maternity clothes, the small wooden rocking chair she'd bought last week. Marcus Vaughn was a god of small, cruel miracles. He had tracked down her landlord, bought the entire building, and rendered her homeless in the time it took her to drive across town. She looked at the pile of her belongings on the sidewalk, the red welt on her face turning a dark, bruised purple. The normal life she had begged Victor for was gone. She reached into the hidden pocket of her nursing bag and pulled out a phone that was older and heavier than the one she used for work. It had no apps, no contacts, and only one button. She stared at it for a long minute, the shadow of a black SUV idling at the end of the block. Marcus Vaughn thought he was fighting a nurse. He had no idea he had just declared war on a ghost. Tiana pressed the button. The heavy, archaic phone felt like a lead weight in Tiana's hand. It didn't ring like a normal device. It emitted a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate against her palm. She sat on the curb beside her boxed-up life, the shadow of her former apartment building looming over her like a tombstone. On the third pulse, the line opened. There was no greeting, no hello, just a heavy, expectant silence that tasted of cold iron. "Victor," Tiana whispered, her voice finally breaking. I really tried to be just a person." Across the city, in a room where the windows were reinforced with steel and the only light came from a dozen silent monitors, Victor Draven stood perfectly still. He didn't need her to explain. He had already seen the high-definition footage of Marcus Vaughn's hands striking her face. He had watched the chief of medicine discard her like a broken tool. He had even tracked the digital signatures as her bank accounts were snuffed out like candles in a gale. "I know," Victor said. His voice was a terrifyingly calm baritone, devoid of the jagged edges of rage. It was the sound of a falling blade, smooth, certain, and final. "He took everything," she choked out, looking at the rocking chair sitting on the damp sidewalk. "He's coming for the baby, Victor. He said he'd put us in a shelter." "He is a man who mistakes a ledger for a soul," Victor replied. He turned away from the monitors, his reflection ghosting across a screen displaying Marcus Vaughn's private home address and offshore routing numbers. "He thinks he has dismantled a nurse. He does not realize he has invited a ghost into his house." "What do I do?" "Go to the black SUV at the end of the block. My men will take you to the estate. There is a medical suite waiting and a doctor who knows the value of silence." Victor paused, and for a fleeting second the lethal chill in his voice thawed into something resembling a brother's promise. "Rest, Tiana, rub your belly and breathe. By the time you wake up, Marcus Vaughn will be discovering that the world he bought is no longer for sale. Victor, don't kill him. Death is a mercy for men like him. Victor said, his eyes locking onto a live feed of Marcus entering a high-end steakhouse, laughing with investors. I am going to let him live long enough to realize that he is worth nothing. I am going to make him a ghost in his own life. The line went dead. Tiana looked up as the black SUV glided toward the curb, the tinted windows hiding the faces of the men inside. For 6 years, she had run from this shadow. Now she stepped into it, knowing that while Marcus Vaughn was celebrating his victory, the current beneath the still water had finally begun to rise. The private dining room at the Gilded Oak was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and crystal, the kind of place where the air tasted of vintage scotch and effortless power. Marcus Vaughn sat at the head of the table, leaning back as he regaled 3 potential investors with the story of his decisive leadership earlier that afternoon. He didn't mention the slap, only that he had liquidated an underperforming asset in the ICU. To growth, Marcus toasted, raising a glass of wine that cost more than Tiana's monthly rent. As the waiter approached with the leather-bound check, Marcus reached for his black titanium card with the practiced nonchalance of a man who had never seen a limit. He slid it onto the tray without looking up. But when the waiter returned 2 minutes later, he wasn't carrying a receipt. He was leaning in close, his voice a panicked whisper. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Vaughn, the card was declined." Marcus laughed, a sharp, abrasive sound. "Check the chip, your machine is broken." "We tried 3 different terminals, sir." "It's an account closed code." Marcus felt a prickle of heat at the back of his neck. He pulled out his backup, a corporate gold card, declined. Then his personal travel card, declined. The investors began to shift in their seats, their expressions turning from admiration to a sharp, predatory curiosity. "Excuse me," Marcus snapped, pulling out his phone. He opened his banking app, expecting to see the comfortable 8-digit balance that usually greeted him. Instead, the screen was a stark, terrifying white. Balance $0. He refreshed the page. A new notification appeared, a digital ghost in the machine. All assets transferred to the Draven Foundation for Single Mothers. "This is a glitch," Marcus hissed, but his hands were beginning to shake. He tried to call his CFO, but his phone's service cut out mid-dial. No signal. Then the television in the corner of the dining room flickered. A news anchor began speaking over a scrolling red banner. Vaughn Enterprises under SEC investigation for massive financial fraud. Stock plummeting 90% in after-hours trading. One by one, the investors stood up. They didn't offer to cover the bill. They didn't even say goodbye. They simply walked out, leaving Marcus alone in a room that suddenly felt far too large. The restaurant manager stepped forward, his previous deference replaced by a cold, professional wall. "Mr. Vaughn, we've just received word from our corporate office. Your membership has been revoked. We'll need you to vacate the premises immediately." Marcus looked down at his titanium card, now just a useless piece of metal. In the reflection of the mahogany table, he saw a man who had gone from a god to a ghost in the span of a single dinner. The current beneath the still water hadn't just risen, it had swallowed him whole. The night air felt like a physical weight as Marcus Vaughn stumbled out of the service entrance of the Gilded Oak. The rain was a cold, needle-sharp drizzle that soaked through his silk shirt, but he didn't feel the chill. His mind was a frantic cage of disappearing options. He reached for his phone again, his thumb hovering over a contact saved only as the fixer. This was a man who handled the impossible, untraceable departures, scrubbed identities, and the kind of protection that $100,000 in cash usually bought in an hour. The line picked up on the first ring, but there was no greeting. "I need out," Marcus hissed, ducking into the shadows of an alleyway. "A private tail, a non-manifest flight out of Teterboro. I don't care about the cost. Get me to the islands." "The cost isn't the problem, Marcus," a raspy voice replied. There was a pause, a sound of a match striking. "The problem is the destination. I just got a message. A digital signature of a wolf's eye was sent to every transport hub in the tri-state area. Do you know what that means?" Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't care about bedtime stories. Just do your job." "My job is survival," the fixer said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The wolf's eye belongs to Victor Draven. He didn't just flag your passport, he put a glass ceiling over the entire city. No pilot will fly you. No driver will pick you up. Even the shadows are refusing to hide you now. You struck his sister, Marcus. You didn't just break a law, you broke the only man who actually matters. I have money, I have. You have nothing. The voice cut him off. I checked. Your accounts are ghosted. Your name is radioactive. If I even talk to you for another 10 seconds, I'm a dead man. Goodbye, Marcus. The line went dead. Marcus stared at the dark screen, the silence of the alleyway suddenly deafening. He looked toward the street corner and saw it. A single black SUV idling at the intersection, its headlights cut, its engine a low, predatory hum. It wasn't moving. It was just waiting. He turned to run the other way, but a tall figure stepped out from behind a dumpster. It wasn't a policeman. It was a man in a black wool coat, his face a mask of lethal stillness. Victor Draven didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence alone was the realization of every nightmare Marcus had ever dismissed as myth. The flight is canceled, Victor said, his voice as cold and final as a closing vault. But don't worry, Marcus. I've arranged a different kind of trip for you. The sunlight streaming through the windows of the Draven Medical Center was warm, filtered by glass that was now reinforced and monitored by the city's most sophisticated security. Tiana sat in a plush rocking chair, the very one that had been tossed onto a damp sidewalk only weeks ago. In her arms, her newborn daughter breathed with a soft, rhythmic whistle, a tiny life untouched by the storm that had cleared the path for her arrival. Tiana looked down at her hands. They were still the hands of a nurse, steady, capable, and kind, but they no longer shook with the weight of being just a person in a world that didn't protect the vulnerable. Victor stood by the window, his back to the room, his silhouette a silent promise that the shadows would never cross this threshold again. "You're going back?" Victor asked, his voice low so as not to wake the infant. "I'm going back as the head of nursing," Tiana said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "But only because I own the department now, and because I have a few things to teach the staff about silence." Across town, at the hospital where Tiana had once been discarded, the morning shift was beginning. Dr. Aris, once the chief of medicine, was also starting his shift. He wasn't wearing a white coat, and no one was waiting for his medical opinion. He was dressed in heavy gray coveralls, his hands gripped around the handle of an industrial floor buffer. He moved in a slow, rhythmic circle, his eyes fixed on the linoleum, terrified to look up at the nurses who now walked past him without a word. He had been stripped of his license, his reputation, and his dignity, left with the only job Victor Draven deemed he was fit for, cleaning up the messes of people more important than himself. And in a federal holding facility miles away, Marcus Vaughn sat on a cold metal bench. The silk shirt was gone, replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit. There were no investors here, no mahogany tables, and no one who cared about his $4 million donations. He had learned too late that money is only power until you strike the one person who doesn't value it. Tiana kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the scent of new life and old lavender. The world outside was still loud, still greedy, and still dangerous, but it no longer had a claim on her. She had spent her life trying to be normal, only to realize that true peace didn't come from hiding who she was. It came from the knowledge that the quietest people in the room aren't the weakest, they're just the ones waiting for the right moment to move. The storm was over, and for the first time in 31 years, the silence was finally hers.